Hey everyone, ready to dive into a chapter of American history that's, well, it's fascinating but often overlooked.
Yeah, it's one of those stories that can be really eye-opening.
Yeah, today we're going to explore how the government has been involved in Black communities.
Right, starting way back with Black Wall Street.
Exactly, Black Wall Street, and then all the way to how things are today,
Mm.
with the modern ghetto.
And we've got some amazing sources this time.
Oh yeah, some really incredible stuff, including, well, we've got this powerful historical analysis.
It really digs deep into the whole story.
It does, and we've got declassified government documents.
Oh yeah, those are always fascinating.
Declassified documents that talk about how the government was actually involved in surveillance.
And disruption tactics, trying to.
It's wild. So get ready for a thought-provoking journey.
We're going to cover a lot of ground.
We are. We're going to unpack things like desegregation, how the welfare state came about, and how the government has had an impact on Black empowerment movements.
There's so much to unpack there.
There is, but we're going to keep it clear and concise, so don't worry.
We want to make sure everyone can follow along.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if you want to be well-informed about this complex history, you've come to the right place.
We're going to break it all down for you.
Okay, so let's rewind the clock back to the early 20th century,
Way back.
to Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
A thriving hub of Black economic power.
You might have heard of Black Wall Street, but honestly, the level of success and innovation there, it's remarkable.
It was truly something special.
It wasn't just about individual businesses either, right?
Yeah.
It was like this whole ecosystem.
Yeah, a whole ecosystem built on Black ownership and cooperation.
They had their own banks, schools, hospitals.
Even their own currency circulating within the community.
It's like, if you were going to show someone what Black self-sufficiency could look like.
Black Wall Street is the perfect example.
And it's even more impressive when you think about how they achieved all this, despite facing so much discrimination.
Constant discrimination and all these systemic barriers.
Yeah, it really makes what happened in 1921 even more tragic.
The Tulsa Race Massacre.
A white mob just destroyed this entire prosperous community.
It's a stark reminder that progress is fragile.
Especially when it's not protected by the very institutions that are supposed to,
The ones that should be upholding justice.
And it wasn't just the violence itself.
The historical analysis we have points to evidence that local authorities were complicit.
They didn't protect Black residents.
And in some cases, they even participated in the destruction.
It's heartbreaking, and it really shows how systemic obstacles, often fueled by racism,
Continued to shape the lives of Black Americans for decades.
the Tulsa Massacre is like this warning sign, Even when Black communities found economic success,
They were still vulnerable.
yeah, vulnerable to white supremacy and a system that was designed to keep them down.
It's a tough truth to confront.
It is, but
Yeah.
we see these patterns repeating, often in more subtle ways, like with the rise of ghettos in American cities.
Those didn't just happen by accident.
No, they were the result of very deliberate policies and practices.
Many of them rooted in racism.
One of the clearest examples is redlining,
Banks would literally draw red lines on maps.
to show where they wouldn't give out loans.
And those areas were predominantly Black.
So even if you were hardworking and responsible,
If you lived in a red line neighborhood, you couldn't get a mortgage.
it was like a self-fulfilling prophecy, They denied Black families access to homeownership.
One of the main ways to build wealth.
So they trapped a lot of people in poverty.
And limited their opportunities.
And it wasn't just redlining either.
It was a whole web of discriminatory housing policies, restrictive covenants,
All these zoning regulations that segregated communities,
and limited their access to resources.
it's almost like the government was actively trying to maintain a racial and economic hierarchy.
Even while the civil rights movement was gaining momentum.
And that leads us to the era of desegregation, which,
On the surface, it looks like a huge victory.
the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, they outlawed segregation.
In public spaces, schools, voting booths, it was huge.
Huge, hard-fought battles.
And they paved the way for a lot of progress.
But our historical analysis suggests that even these victories, well,
They were complex.
yeah, desegregation might have unintentionally weakened some of the institutions that had supported Black neighborhoods.
Think about it. In a lot of cities, Black communities had built their own schools, businesses.
Their own social organizations because they were excluded from the white-dominated ones.
Those places weren't just about getting services.
They were hubs of Black culture, economic empowerment, and places where people connected.
So when desegregation happened, resources shifted.
And a lot of these Black institutions got left behind.
They struggled to survive.
And it raises these really tough questions, Did desegregation actually erode the social and economic fabric of some Black communities.
Did integration come at the cost of losing some of the hard-won gains that Black communities had fought for?
It's a complicated legacy for sure. We see progress, but also this potential unintended consequence.
Weakening the very institutions that had provided so much support.
And it's a debate that's still going on today.
It has implications for how we think about social justice and equity in the 21st century.
How do we achieve true equality while also preserving the cultural and economic strengths that exist within marginalized communities?
It's a question we're going to keep exploring as we go.
Okay, so now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the 1970s.
A period of major expansion of the welfare state.
Programs like food stamps, Medicaid, TANF, they were all introduced then,
With the goal of alleviating poverty.
providing a safety net.
It was a time of a lot of social reform.
Driven by this belief that the government should address economic inequality and support its citizens.
It seemed like a positive step.
On the surface, yeah, towards a more just and equitable society.
But like a lot of well-intentioned policies, it wasn't that simple.
And our sources really dig into this. Some argue that while the welfare state helped a lot of families,
Especially in times of need.
it also might have fostered dependency.
And undermined self-sufficiency.
There's this debate about whether some programs discouraged work or marriage because of how they were structured.
Especially within Black communities that were already facing disadvantages.
And on top of that, you have the introduction of direct tax withholding in the 1970s.
Yeah, that was a big change.
It made things easier for the government, but it also meant that people, especially those living paycheck to paycheck,
They had less control over their earnings.
money was automatically deducted from their paychecks.
It felt like a loss of control for some.
And for a lot of Black workers who were already marginalized, it was another burden.
It reduced their ability to manage their own resources.
So you've got these two forces at play, the welfare state trying to help.
And direct tax withholding, which felt like a loss of control for some.
And some argue that this combination contributed to a growing sense of economic disempowerment in Black communities.
It highlights how we need to think carefully about the unintended consequences of policies.
Even the ones that are meant to help.
Finding that balance is a challenge policymakers still struggle with today.
And all of this is happening while the Black Power movement is emerging.
In the 1960s, as a response to the limitations of the civil rights movement,
Black Power was about so much more than just desegregation.
it was about self-determination, self-sufficiency.
Building independent Black institutions.
It was a vital shift in focus.
Emphasizing Black pride, cultural identity.
A more assertive approach to achieving equality.
You think about figures like Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, they challenged the idea that integration was the only path.
They argued that Black communities needed to build power from within.
Control their own destiny.
To find their own success.
And that led to all sorts of amazing initiatives, community-controlled schools, health clinics, Black-owned businesses.
It was a time of incredible creativity and innovation.
But here again, our sources point out that there's this layer of complexity.
A theory that the Black Power movement, while powerful, may have been hindered by external forces.
By external forces, we mean things like government intervention, surveillance.
The influence of corporations, philanthropic organizations.
It's like the forces the movement was pushing back against found ways to infiltrate it.
To redirect it or even undermine its goals.
And it raises these questions about how social movements navigate power dynamics, funding sources, external influence.
Who's really in control? Who benefits from the resources? Are the strategies actually helping the communities they're supposed to represent?
It's not just about fighting for a cause.
It's about being aware of the potential problems.
And navigating those complexities.
That's a lesson that's still relevant today.
As we see new movements for social justice facing similar challenges.
Absolutely. And it brings us to this chilling chapter.
The declassified documents that expose the FBI's COINTELPRO program.
It's hard to believe how far the government went to disrupt groups they saw as subversive.
Black organizations, especially the Black Panther Party, were their main targets.
These documents show the dark side of government power.
The lengths they were willing to go to suppress dissent.
And the tactics they used were like something out of a movie.
Spreading misinformation, inciting violence, planting informants, framing people for crimes they didn't commit.
It was systematic.
Meant to create discord, distrust, and dismantle organizations seen as threats.
One of the most tragic examples is the story of Fred Hampton,
chairman of the Illinois Black Panther Party.
Assassinated in his sleep by the FBI and Chicago police in 1969.
His death and the revelations about COINTELPRO were a huge shock.
They exposed the brutal reality of state repression.
Hampton's assassination became a symbol of the government silencing dissent.
It fueled distrust in law enforcement, especially in Black communities.
And it's a legacy that still affects us today.
COINTELPRO might be over, but concerns about surveillance of Black activists haven't gone away.
Especially with social media monitoring, data mining, facial recognition technology.
It raises questions about the balance between security and civil liberties.
Especially for marginalized communities that have been targeted in the past.
It's this constant tension between the government's power to protect and its potential to overreach.
Finding that balance is tough.
It requires constant vigilance, critical examination of what the government is doing,
And a commitment to protecting everyone's rights.
regardless of their race, beliefs, or politics.
So wow, we've covered a lot. From Black Wall Street to desegregation, the welfare state, the Black Power movement.
And the chilling revelations of COINTELPRO.
What are your thoughts so far? What's standing out to you?
It's a history full of complexities,
Contradictions, dark chapters.
but also resilience, innovation, this constant pursuit of justice.
And it shapes our present in such profound ways.
Understanding this history isn't just about looking back.
It's about equipping ourselves to navigate the present and create a better future for everyone.
Absolutely. So stay tuned as we continue this journey and explore the connections between these historical events and the social justice movements happening today.
We've got a lot more to uncover, so stick with us.
You know, it's as we go deeper into these events and the government's actions, it's impossible not to notice the parallels with what social justice movements are going through today.
Yeah, it's like history is giving us a roadmap, showing us what could go wrong and what it really takes to make a change.
One of the biggest connections is this question of funding and influence, like with the Black Power movement.
Yeah, there's this debate about whether even well-meaning movements get steered off course by outside forces.
It's that saying, right? He who pays the piper calls the tune. We've seen how even supportive government programs and initiatives can come with strings attached.
Yeah, and that can shift the focus away from what really empowers people at the grassroots level.
Think about Black Lives Matter. It started as this powerful force fueled by anger and grief over police brutality. But then as it grew, people started questioning where its funding came from and if certain agendas were taking priority.
It's like a repeat of what happened with the Black Power movement, where outside forces might have changed its direction and how effective it could be.
Exactly, and I think it shows how important critical thinking is within these movements, asking tough questions like where's the money coming from, who's setting the agenda, are the strategies really helping the communities they're supposed to?
It's about understanding that real power comes from the people, from their collective voice and their ability to act.
And that means understanding history, learning from the past, and making sure movements are accountable to the communities they serve so they don't repeat the mistakes of the past where outsiders end up controlling the narrative or resources don't reach the people who need them most.
It's like we're building on what came before, right? We have this legacy of activism and resistance, but we also got to learn from the lessons, the mistakes, and the strategies that worked against those in power.
The historical analysis we've been looking at really makes this point. It says that lasting change needs more than just awareness or new policies. It needs a total change in the systems that create inequality.
So it's not about getting a seat at the table. It's about building a whole new table.
Right, and that means changing how we think, both within and outside of Black communities. It's about seeing the good things that are already there and getting rid of the things that have held those communities back.
And being careful about support that seems well-intentioned, as we've seen. Government programs and even charities can sometimes do more harm than good when they don't truly get the communities they're trying to help.
And that's why it's so important for movements to stay independent, connected to their roots, and committed to deciding their own path.
Remember Black Wall Street, that amazing example of what Black communities can do on their own. It shows us that real freedom comes from building our own things, controlling our own resources, and deciding what success looks like for us.
It's about taking back control of the story, challenging the way things are, and creating new systems that put Black communities first.
And that brings us to technology, how it can both make things worse and help break down systems of oppression.
It's interesting how technology is like a double-edged sword. On one hand, it helps people speak out, organize, and show the world what's wrong in a way we couldn't before.
Like how social media exposed police brutality and got people to support Black Lives Matter.
Right. It's been amazing for raising awareness and connecting people all over the world.
But it can also be used for surveillance, for digging up information about people, and for strengthening the systems that are already in place.
Like facial recognition software being used to track Black people, or algorithms that create bias in hiring or loan applications.
It feels like we're always trying to stay ahead of the technology, to use it for good, and stop it from being used to hurt people.
And that means we got to understand how these systems work, who's controlling them, and how they can either keep things the same or change them for the better.
So it's not enough to just know how to use technology. We have to be critical of it.
We have to ask who benefits from it, who's being left out, and how we can make sure it creates a fairer world instead of making existing problems worse.
It's like we're in this new digital world where the rules are still being made, and it's our responsibility to demand rules that protect our rights, our privacy, and our well-being.
And that's where history is so important. The struggles of past movements, what they did, the mistakes they made, and their successes can teach us how to navigate this new technological world.
It's about using what we know from the past to make a better future. And that includes being aware of how technology can be used both to free people and to oppress them.
And I think that leads perfectly into the next part of our discussion, where we'll look at some real examples of how these historical events and the lessons we've talked about are showing up in social justice movements today.
Stay with us because things are about to get really interesting and thought-provoking. Wow, we've really been through a lot in this deep dive. From Black Wall Street to desegregation, the welfare state, the Black Power movement, government surveillance, even how technology plays a role in social change. It's a lot to think about. What are your main takeaways?
Yeah, it's been quite a journey. It really hits home that history isn't just something in the past. It's alive, and it shapes everything around us today, even what might happen in the future. The things we've seen, both good and bad, they give us clues about how to make a more just and fair society.
Totally agree. It's like we're learning from the people who came before us, both their successes and their mistakes.
And it's not just about Black history either. It's about the history of America itself. The fight for Black liberation is a big part of the fight for justice and equality for everyone in America.
So what does all this mean for us right now? How do we use what we've learned to make sure future movements for social justice are really effective and empowering?
That's the big question, isn't it? And there's no simple answer, but I think our deep dive has given us some important lessons.
All years.
The most important thing is that real power comes from within. It's about building strong communities that can take care of themselves, encouraging economic independence, and taking back control of our resources and our stories.
Like Black Wall Street did, right? They showed us what can happen when communities work together, support each other, and create their own ways to succeed.
Exactly. It's about not relying on systems outside of our control and building things that let communities thrive in their own way. And that requires a change in how we think, both inside and outside of these communities. It's about seeing the good things that are already there and getting rid of the obstacles that have kept them from growing.
And I think it's also about realizing how powerful it is when people unite and stand together.
Yeah.
Throughout history, we've seen that social change happens when people, no matter their race or background, come together to fight for something they believe in.
Absolutely. The civil rights movement is a perfect example. It wasn't just Black people fighting for their rights. It was people from all walks of life coming together to demand justice and equality for everyone.
And that brings me to another important point: education. The more we know about our history, the better we are at spotting the things that keep people oppressed, challenging the way things are, and creating a fairer future.
Like they say, knowledge is power. The more we learn about the systems that create inequality, the better we'll be at breaking them down.
And it's not just about reading books or listening to podcasts. It's about having those difficult conversations, questioning our own beliefs, and being open to changing our minds.
It's about listening, learning, and growing.
And I think we also need to remember that fighting for justice is a long game. There will be times when it feels like we're losing ground, but we can't give up.
And it's a fight that needs us to understand history and to be brave, creative, and smart in how we approach it. We have to learn from the mistakes of the past and be open to trying new things.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought. What can you do to support marginalized communities and help create a world where everyone is treated fairly?
Maybe it's supporting businesses owned by people of color, volunteering your time to organizations fighting for social justice, learning more about these issues and teaching others, or just having honest conversations about race, equality, and the systems that keep things unfair.
Everything we do, even the small things, can make a difference. Together, all those actions can create a wave of change that leads to a better world.
So don't think you can't make a difference. Get involved, stay informed, and never stop fighting for a better world.
And that's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey.